Alrighty, hello every folks, and good morning. Welcome to a quick little frequently asked question type deal here. Um, because a lot of folks ask how difficult is it to get into One Vision compared with the official versions? Because the series itself is known for its impenetrability, whereas something like One Vision is also known for its deep complexity. So, do those two things stack on top of each other? Does it do something to address those particular issues, or what's the deal there? So, first little notion that I want to get into before answering that question is that, like, when it comes to One Vision, it's not just a tweak of the PSP version. Please understand that the PSP version had a lot of interesting systems, but the way that it was designed was kind of a combination of why would they do it like this, and yeah, this ain't done. Like, in terms of, like, being able to rank up skills and stuff like that is pretty darn cool. You have a character that's getting better at fighting particular things by, equipping a skill that lets them understand those kinds of things. And okay, cool, that's all well and neat, but it never explains most of its systems. A lot of its stuff is really backloaded to the point that, like, let's say stuff like being able to run parry and deflect builds just never ends up happening because you end up getting those skills, either mid-game if you know what you're doing, or late-game if you don't. Potentially might completely miss how good a lot of the skills are. There's a lot of skills, like on the lizards and stuff, that you just simply don't see until the very end of the game, and most people stop at Chapter 4 and don't use them for the post-game and stuff like that. Even those that did get into the post-game had a tendency to be utterly overwhelmed by the sheer amount of sudden new mechanics that got dropped on them. And that's kind of where the question comes up, because both of the quote-unquote better versions of this game now did address those issues in very different ways. So let's address how Reborn handled it real quick, which, frankly, we're not covering everything because that would be way too long of a list. Both Reborn and One Vision are just complete overhauls of that PSP version. I would not recommend playing the PSP version at this point when both of these other two versions are available. Again, you might have seen the occasional person popping by like, oh man, I miss how you could go and, grind for this, that, or the other. No, they are misremembering it, I swear to you. Anyway, so as far as the sort of official version, their approach was completely overhauling the leveling system of the game, because for the sake of reference, this PSP version that all of the versions are built off of originally used a system in which the classes are separate from the unit, and so basically you would level up a unit, they would level up the class, and then the unit themselves kept their kind of skills and equipment and stuff like that, but then the class determined their equipment availability, the sort of classes stats themselves, as well as giving them a small one-time bonus when they leveled up as that class. And you might already see the problem with that system, where, like, you would end up having to know about this thing ahead of time, even though it never told you this, even in the manual. So the sort of optimal way to do it was to level somebody up through multiple classes, but you change your entire party to all these different classes and level them up separately, by which point you do this a couple of times and the game's already broken. Like, there's no challenge from Chapter 1 going up until, like, post-game Chapter 4. If you want to see that happen, go watch the solo run that I did a while ago, because it's basically just coasting through the entire game. So yeah, it's a system that on paper sounds like, oh, there's going to be all this satisfying grind and skill combinations and whatever else, and ultimately just turns into, you can just grind for a little bit, and then just the rest of the game has no challenge or pushback whatsoever. Now, what they did in the Reborn version was they did a more traditional leveling system, and they put level caps, but they also drastically increased the power of things like buffs and debuffs and elemental weaknesses, which the elemental weakness part didn't really exist in the PSP version. That's another one of those things that gets misremembered a lot. So they basically added a weakness system. They like 2 or 3 times buffed most of the buffs and debuffs and stuff like that. And so this meant that while you had a level cap, your power never really came from levels to begin with, in any of these versions. It wasn't the levels themselves, it was the stuff surrounding them. So, like, in the SNES version, yeah, it was mostly about levels. Technically, the stats because of the levels, but there really weren't too many other options. In the PSP version, it was largely because you could cheese those base stat gains by leveling people up across multiple classes, and then the skill ranks were further broken on top of that. So like you train somebody in anatomy, they became stronger against every people unit in the game. You train them with their weapon, they became stronger against everything in the game. You train them with their element once they got an elemental weapon, and once again we stack all of this all over again, and all of these different stacks got quickly out of control. The Reborn version, again, changes it to a more kind of static thing, where if you stack your advantages, you're going to have a pretty easy time, but your power never came from levels to begin with, and that's what gets folks frustrated about that level cap system. They're like, oh man, I can't grind past the level cap. Yeah, no shit, it was never the thing that you were supposed to be doing in the first place. Like, those levels in general give you like 2 or 3 points in your stats, depending, and that is like a 1% bonus once all said and done at the end of the day. It's not a huge thing, whereas something like Breach is 50% right from the get-go. An elemental bonus is 30%. Give somebody a verse, it's another like 20% or so, depending on the context. You strengthen for another 15%. Like, just use your buffs and debuffs. It ain't hard. Now, that simplification generally made it so that a lot more folks got into that official version and generally understood what made the kind of like breakthrough-centric strategy of the Tactics Ogre experience so darn fun. What One Vision does is quite a bit different. So it takes in a little bit of a different direction, where you still have these levels and things on hand. However, you don't actually gain those base stat gains when you do this. So effectively, when you get a new class, they've got a lot more tools to play with, but you're essentially ranking them up for the purpose of having them join your team, which was the original intent of this kind of system. However, it also combines in essentially, it also combines in an effect wherein if you're using the kind of recommended install and whatever else, you're going to be using the low-level class XP scaling fix, which means that when I say that the focus is on keeping all of your people kind of balanced together with one level, this means that, let's say, instead of the PSP version where you would get a new class and then have to kind of slowly grind them up and whatever else, what you can do in this case is just basically throw them in the back of your team for a fight, and they will just immediately catch up. That they will eat all the experience for that fight, which typically means that they're only 1 or 2 fights away from just joining the rest of your team, along with whatever toolbox they happen to bring with them. So, in general, while I'm explaining it kind of poorly here, this means that the leveling system, where the focus is largely on just keeping your people balanced rather than going for that straight upward push there, does generally make it feel that that your team is working on their skills and stuff like that, rather than trying to, gain a arbitrary gamey system in the form of levels. So generally speaking, you'll see that the levels are not really as much of a thing in this one, but you'll notice that you're making a lot more use of your skills. So like your weapon ranks and stuff like that, the way that you're going and setting up your equipment, it leads to this moment where between the different story events, you've got a lot of moments where you're going to kind of quietly go back into the garage and tinker, so to speak, changing people's builds. Like different equipment will give them different skill bonuses and stuff like that. Let's take this moment right here, right? So, like, this guy was originally a knight, and I changed him to a terror knight because what the hell, why not? And he happens to use recruit, and so when we're out here in this random fight, even though he's got pretty low odds of actually recruiting this guy, I'm just going to have him talk to every person that he can just to grind up his recruiting skill, so that he ends up being a bit better at that when push comes to shove. Like, when we're in a bit of a harder fight, because this is an Iron Man run right now, then we will potentially see a situation that he might be able to actually recruit somebody at a crucial moment. Or, let's say taking some time to train people with weapons that maybe the class otherwise wouldn't use for the purpose of having other skills later on down the line. Like, let's say a sword on a rogue who might be able to make some good use of their backstabbing skill while let's say, using a weapon that's got a high damage modifier on it. So, it might be useful, and the extra range from something like a rapier might be useful. I don't know. I'm just experimenting around with different things, but this means that you spend more time thinking about your builds more so than thinking about, I gotta go live that grind set and stuff like that. And that's a very nice feeling. It's one of those things that makes this one kind of very pleasant to get into, because you spend a lot of time just kind of thinking about how your people work, rather than thinking about making their numbers go up. Now, as far as its kind of approachability compared with the official versions, though, there is actually one kind of note that you don't generally think about that does actually give a serious edge to starting here as opposed to the official versions. See, in the official versions, oftentimes the stat allocations seem almost entirely random. With, like, let's say you got a longsword or a broadsword in the official versions, it's like, okay, heavy weapon with a big strength bonus. Makes sense, sure. And then you got, like, you then have, let's say, a blow dart, and it's like, oh, hey, this blow dart's got, like, 3 times the stats of that you know, heavy claymore over there. What's the deal with that? Why does this thing have a ton of stats, but then the you know, then this other stuff doesn't? And that kind of utter randomness is generally cool in terms of setting up. You know, setting up a lot of questions as far as how this weapon's meant to be used, but it does feel a little bit out of nowhere in some cases. Whereas in One Vision's case, it's generally a lot more straightforward about exactly what everything is intended to be doing, even if you find some other use for it. So, like, let's say you look at the dagger, and it's like, okay, agility bonus. Agility is your ability to hit stuff physically, and hey, you don't know what agility does, you just quickly mouse over to agility, and it'll be like, yo, accuracy. It is what it does. Like, if you hit select at any point, it will tell you what everything does with a lot more detail than the official versions did. It'll tell you exactly what everything is. If there's a, let's say, confusing number over here, like this is just a symbol and a number, and it says piercing damage, and it's a percentage bonus. Okay, cool. You know, the weight, you know, a red number, and like when it comes to most of these descriptions, they've been redone. Like, you don't know what category a weapon falls into. Like, let's say daggers over here. It's like, oh, light weapon. Okay, then we go over to our stats, and it's like strength improves light weapon damage. Sure, dexterity does it more. It's got 2+ symbols. So generally, it's a lot more direct as far as just telling you, hey, look, this is how this is meant to be used, and maybe you'll find some other use for it. You know, it mentions that heavy crossbows are going to be powerful, but they're slow to reload, and that's very accurate. Like, let's say the lightweight crossbows take, let's say, half the time or less to actually fire than the heavy crossbows, but they won't penetrate armor as well, but they've got a poison effect on there. They've got a mental boost on there. That might be useful for spellcasters, and it's up to you to kind of figure out these puzzles, but it is more direct in terms of telling you, like, hey, look, this is directly going to be part of this category. This is exactly what this thing does. You know, like a heavy axe that takes 2 hands. Okay, you know, heavy weapon. It overpowers. It breaches defense. Makes sense. It's a heavy axe. We've got a sword. You know, a common one-handed sword. It's simple and reliable. Okay, reliable. It's easy to hit with. It's got that agility bonus again. It's good at opening up attacks versus enemy units. You know, lightweight shields that are used for deflecting attacks. Okay, it's going to give you some avoidance. It's going to. It's a shield. It makes sense. It's going to knock something backwards. You know, let's say stuff like Knuckles here. You know, a one-handed fist weapon suited for fighting defensively will be the description for many of these types of weapons. But then you notice the edges of the weapons, and it's like, oh, if they've got a knuckle on there, they might stun something. If they've got claws on there, they're going to be poisonous claws. And it says it's good for fighting defensively. It again gives you an avoidance bonus. So. Again, all of these descriptions are generally going to be a lot more kind of suited towards explaining what the hell you're trying to do with the thing in the first place, you know? And generally, everything's got multiple uses. So, like, let's say something like Squash. This is a skill that previously would get rid of some obstacles in the field and had no other use. And nobody would ever put this on their skill list. It's something that was so useless that, like many other skills that nobody ever used, Reborn didn't even bother. And so, like, in this case, it instead breaks every obstacle. When used on an enemy unit, it potentially causes them to stagger backwards, making them easier to hit with follow-up attacks and stuff like that. Like, are there still a ton of mechanics in this game? Sure. But the fact that it describes the stuff better, the fact that things have multiple uses in order to better sell the sort of vibe of what that thing is supposed to be, generally means that things are more approachable in that particular way. Additionally, actually, one thing that both of the sort of better versions did is make it so that stuff's more logical in terms of items. Now, for those that don't remember PSP, there were basically kind of trainings that you had to do in the form of field alchemy in order to be able to understand your items. So this meant, for example, if you just went and picked up a unit, they would understand how to use a near-worthless standard healing leaf and then no other healing items. Like, they just straight up didn't understand how to put a band-aid on themselves. I kid you not, they literally could not use a band-aid. So they had to be trained with field alchemy in order to understand that. They had to be trained with field alchemy of a different rank, and everybody could max out that item rank eventually, but it took a decently long time to get all of those skills up. And additionally, oftentimes it just came at really annoying times. Like field alchemy, if you didn't know where to pick up those particular ranks, or you just didn't know that it was a thing, it could be really frustrating to see your unit pinned to the ground for an extended period of time because you didn't exactly know how to get rid of that debuff. Or let's say you had something like Bewitch, and it's like, oh, you didn't go and upgrade your standard anti-charm item in order to make it get rid of Bewitch. Oh, well, fuck you. How did you not think to do that ahead of time and individually do that for every single time that you want to get rid of this debuff? It was extraordinarily unintuitive. You had to train a unit to use those items. You had to then further remember to keep the skill on you at all times, and then further remember to get very, very specific items for different things. And so, like in the Reborn version, they gave everybody sort of an XCOM backpack where they're like, here you go, you just stick stuff in your item pouch and you can just use it. Your characters are no longer have brain damage. You're welcome. And that's, again, that was good. It's one of those things that made it very approachable for folks, finally, for the first time in a while. But when it comes to, let's say One Vision, what they did was sort of an interesting middle ground of both, where you still have the potentially interesting thing of locking away certain items for certain people, but everybody is still able to, for example, use basic items. So, like, most of the standard healing stuff will not only scale throughout the game, but it additionally will be more widely available. Stuff to get rid of most debuffs is going to be available by most units, but, for example, stuff like advanced projectile type weapons, or things like advanced healing items that do an absolute full heal on somebody, or like stuff like elemental orbs and stuff like that. Those types of things took somebody with a bit more knowledge. So, like, let's say somebody like a warlock would be able to not only use all items, but they would be able to generate items on their own. Stuff like a Valkyrie is able to throw items without needing an item or a skill or anything. It's just a thing they can do. Actually, warlocks can do that as well. Stuff like, actually, Beast Tamers too. Forgot about that. I think they got that after Reborn added that. But in general, items just feel logical. Like, a basic soldier is able to use basic first aid type stuff, but they wouldn't be able to use the more advanced stuff no matter what you did. Let's say they swapped over to a berserker and they've got some terrible access. Like, they're meant to be a berserker, so they're not going to be able to use many items, but the smarter a class is on paper, the more they're able to use. And so this gives you a lot of flexibility, but it also gives you a lot of kind of meat on the bone as far as the kind of logical conclusions that you can come to as far as who can use what. Additionally, we had other situations like, I forgot to put it on her right here, but let's say something like a knight, instead of just healing, would be able to use a lot of first aid type spells, but they wouldn't be able to just kind of sit there spam healing the entire time, Again, giving them a bit more character in general. The units, since they tend to stick to their classes, like Tactics Ogre in general is not about upgrading your classes for the most part. This meant that they got to live in their class and do the kinds of things that class should be able to do a lot more. Like in that case, that archer didn't really have any good effective options with their bow versus the armor of that knight, so she just picked up some sand and threw that in her face to make her blind. And that's, again, there's a lot of little character moments like that that make this just feel very logical. There's a lot more stuff going on, but logic-wise it makes a lot of sense. Like, let's say in this case, when it came to Voltaire, he currently has had his legs broken for a while, because I didn't remember to go get anything to actually deal with that particular debuff, but debuffs in general tend to last a pretty decently long time. So when he got hamstrung by a critical hit from a dagger that stabbed him in the leg, he's been stuck there for a decent minute at this point. But again, you'll generally find that stuff is very intuitive in One Vision, so personally I would say while there is more going on, it can be overwhelming for somebody that tries to absorb all of it at one time. In general, it tends to be paced out better to the point that it's usually going to be more logical for many folks that end up trying it. Again, there's a lot of unusual aspects to it, but I feel like for most that have at least played an SRPG before, they probably would be able to pick up on this relatively quickly. Because, again, there's also a lot more kind of utility of tools that you maybe wouldn't necessarily always see. Like, let's say, somebody like the Varden in the PSP version originally, when it came to stuff like their Fireball there, or, you know, their other spells, they never got access to Spellcraft, which meant that they never really did any proper damage with them, which always felt like a weird dangling loose end. And they did improve that in Reborn. You know, they improved not only their stats, they lessened resistance to all of those spells, so they typically were not just bouncing off completely. But what we see in One Vision is a more flexible system in which you're constantly sort of living in that almost early game section where like, let's say, you know, somebody's got evasive equipment, they will always remain evasive. The stats simply will not overwhelm that evasion. You can do it, but the status quo never gets completely crushed by progression. So, like, let's say you as a player could eventually max out somebody's skills. You could get them a bunch of fancy equipment from all corners of the earth, and you could go and hunt monsters in the woods, go and sell them to the shop in order to get meat items, sell all those treasure items you got along the way for a ton of money to be able to afford those very expensive meat items, and go absolutely stat crunch that character. And yeah, you can become overpowered eventually by doing this kinds of stuff. But generally, this means that like, when it comes to your grind, it's something that you generally get a lot more satisfaction out of. I personally feel in this particular version that if you want to grind, the sort of breakthrough feels that much better. Again, in my opinion, everyone's going to have their own opinions and whatnot, but just kind of in general. And additionally, there's just a lot more kind of character here in terms of the like, let's say the items that I was talking about earlier, in terms of like sellables and stuff like that. Instead of necessarily needing to know, like, hey, you know, I need to keep this much of this piece of equipment, this much of another piece of equipment, there's an entire separate treasure tab for all kinds of just neat things you find along the way. Like, you know, you go and you kill off or let's say you go rob a berserker, and it's like, hey, look, they had the Eye of the Tiger. Awesome, that's hilarious. They, you know, you go kill a wizard or rob a wizard or something like that. It's like, oh, hey, they had a golden snitch. That's also hilarious. You go rob the Knight Commanders. Oh, hey, look, they had ceremonial gear that matches the stuff that they were equipping. That's kind of cool, because they have, you know, the parade versions that they would use for, you know, various triumphs and stuff like that. So, again, there's a lot of kind of just logical stuff here. I mean, you can still sell your equipment to make up funds, but the fact that just like the little addition of this treasure category over here means that you regularly will be able to fund all of the stuff that you're doing without necessarily needing to sell your equipment proper. Is it still recommended to pretty much sell everything other than a few pieces? Yeah, you know, keep a little bit of everything on hand and whatnot. But still, it's just cool that that's even there. Now, there's a million and one different things I could go on, and this video has gone on long enough. The main point I'm trying to get across here is just that, yeah, in general, I would say that this is just as easy to get into as the official versions, arguably easier because of the more helpful tooltips. The class system may still take some getting used to, but as long as you understand that levels were never your power to begin with, it's basically a more freeform version of the level cap system from Reborn, because in many ways, you're kind of setting up your own level cap system because the game scales with you. So if you try to power level through the thing, you won't really get much other than a higher difficulty. And frankly, that was one of those issues with PSP, because you could accidentally over-level yourself trying to become overpowered, the game would scale up on you, and then you were just stuck in a position that they had equipment that you couldn't even touch. One Vision fixes that by generally making things a lot more uniform across the board, so you have the benefit of not getting yourself stuck in some stupid arbitrary manner like Reborn was trying to fix, and then you also have the benefit of still being able to technically grind for stuff like skills and whatever else, which is pretty darn fun. I personally find grinding for skills a lot more satisfying than just simply making the number go up, and I really like this the fact that you can do things like training up your recruit skills or augments or things like that. And this further gets more interesting by the fact that like, let's say human characters can't learn anatomy, but for example something like a skeleton or a lizard could. So this might mean that your lizards or skeletons or something like that could combine that anatomy skill with their recruit skill, having incredibly high recruit odds when going and attacking enemy units. It leads to a lot of kind of fun little team building type options as time goes on. And yeah, in general, that's kind of about that. So I gotta get going. You'll have yourselves a good one. Take care, and yeah, I hope this was useful for you. All right, y'all take care, and I'll see you next time.